Thank you for joining us at the Cleveland Clinic 2020 Innovation Summit. Today I'm joined with an incredible group of colleagues from Cleveland Clinic to talk about life in a pandemic and a little bit of a perspective on how Cleveland Clinic responded to that pandemic and the innovations that we brought to it. I'm Jim Merlino. I'm the Chief Clinical Transformation Officer at the Cleveland Clinic. I'm joined here by Dr. Bob Wiley, who's our Chief Medical Operations Officer, Steve Gordon, who's our Chief of Infectious Disease, Lara, Jehi, who's our Chief Research Information Officer, and Brian Rubin, who's our Chair of our Pathology and Laboratory Medicine group. Each of them played a critical role in how the organization was turned into the wind to fight the pandemic. And we're going to share some of our perspective on what we did, how we did it, and how we really came together as an organization. So with that, Bob, I'm going to turn to you first. I remember at the start of the pandemic, as we saw this tsunami coming at us towards the end of February, early March, I think one of the first things you did is went over and turned the lights on in the Incident Command Center to start preparing this organization to manage in this pandemic. Can you talk a little bit about your work and how we did that?
Sure, Jim, and thanks for the opportunity. So we watched cases come out of Asia in the last part of 2019, and we watched them expand to various countries from China, various other countries in Asia, and then to Europe. And we knew that it was going to come across the Atlantic or the Pacific, either one, and come to the United States. So the first case in the United States was about January 19th. March 9th was the first case we actually had in Ohio. And the governor reacted very quickly, and we activated Incident Command. Even before we activated Incident Command, we started looking at our PPE and supplies. And we started looking at products which were about to expire and said, well, maybe we're going to hang on to these. Maybe we can use them a little bit longer. We talked with the manufacturers because we looked at the potential of how many patients we might have. And the potential during the early modeling was significant, up to 8,000, using a model from the University of Pennsylvania, which we later actually tweaked and refined and gave back to the University of Pennsylvania to use. So following March 9th, with the first case in Ohio, we went to real activation of the Incident Command full-time, 7 days a week. On March 12th, the governor had ordered reacted to close the schools. A few days later, he closed the bars. And by the 23rd of March, he actually put in a stay-at-home order. And that led to a rapid decline in the number of patients and where we thought we were going. So we can measure social distancing by cell phone utilization and by car movement, and we did both. And the cell phone utilization is de-identified, so we don't know whose cell phone it is, but we can watch how much the cell phones are moving. And what we learned was that there was over a 70% drop in terms of people being sociable with each other. So people were staying at home, and they profoundly affected the number of patients. At the same time, we did three things in Incident Command. The first one was to look at our modeling, which I've told you about. Then to plan, okay, worst case scenario in the 21 county area, how many beds would we need? And it turned out under the worst case scenario, if nothing good happened, we'd need about 8,000 beds. So we took at our 3,500 bed footprint and we said, okay, let's take it to 8,000. And we actually did that. We took the medical education campus as part of that, turned it into what we called the Hope Hospital. And the Hope Hospital had over 1,000 beds, which we fully outfitted, including gas lines and other medical equipment which we needed. The second thing was to create a cascade system so that smaller hospitals, whether they belong to the Cleveland Clinic or whether they belong to other systems in the state, if they started to get overwhelmed with high numbers of COVID patients, we could transfer them in. And so we created a cascade. One example was in Columbiana County, there's a thing called the Elkton Federal Penitentiary. They had an outbreak, and they quickly went over the number of beds in the local hospitals in New Salem. And from that, we said, no problem. What we're going to do is we're going to take those patients, we're going to take them up to Akron, both to our hospital and Suma's hospital. And then from there, if we need to, we're going to go to Cleveland. And we did the same thing with other outbreaks that occurred. The last thing we did was start to coordinate the activity of the local health departments, congregate care sites, because we knew there were going to be hot spots, and we started to bring those all together.
Thanks for that answer, Bob. It's really an incredible amount of work in a short period of time, particularly when you consider where we started and now where we are from a maturity standpoint in managing the new normal. It's interesting, Steve, as I think about COVID, we all think about it. We have decades to study most of the diseases that we currently manage across the world. This disease, essentially today, we've had 9 months to learn about it. and sometimes the information changes, and daily, sometimes it seems like we get new information. From the perspective of someone who's been leading the infectious disease response for the organization, give us your perspective on what you were thinking on the early days and how your thinking has evolved as you were advising on how to manage the pandemic, but also how to take care of patients with COVID.
Well, thank you, Jim, and thanks for that query. You know, as I reflect and we continue to reflect, as we've talked about, the one thing that I have learned is humility in this. And this pathogen, the SARS-CoV-2 causing COVID-19, is really a remarkable foe. And I think we've all continued to learn lessons as we moved along. As was mentioned by Dr. Wiley, standing up the Incident Command Center, we knew something was coming. However, we actually didn't know this virus had already taken place in the homeland the way that it did, and the rapidity of the spread. And if you think about it, it's almost tailor-made for a pandemic. This virus has a propensity to spread rapidly between person to person, including transmission for people that aren't symptomatic, which is problematic in terms of detection and control. The fact that we had no underlying immunity also helps in terms of this pathogen spreading. And then, of course, as mentioned, in this era of international travel, it was travel and conveyance that also helped the diaspora of the virus. Now, once it's set place, I think appropriately, most of us, we had seen what was going on in Europe and looking at China. Our focus primarily focused on trying to be sure that we could take care of the sickest of the patients, in that we weren't going to be in that moral dilemma of seeing a patient that required, let's say, a ventilator and not having that. We'll hear more about supply chain, but it was a fantastic in terms of what was done. And the organization quickly pivoted to what my boss would say, Dr. Dweck, focusing on the stuff, the supplies, and the space, as well as obviously the personnel. And I think one of the most remarkable things that we observed was that system of care, that team of teams. Dr. Wiley had mentioned things outside of our system, but within the system, all of our ICUs were able to take care of the sickest of COVID patients where they sat. And there was this remarkable learning, bi-directional, that was going on in some of the innovations, such as we saw, that is having the lines extend out so the ventilators were outside, the dialysis machines were outside to avoid unnecessary exposures, and other creative things were just amazing to watch and then be put into play. Now, when we talk about treatment, it is interesting. To date, we still don't have a home run for COVID-19. People know about therapeutics. The virus was sequenced relatively early, and that sequencing in January, giving us, again, its genome, is very helpful, helped to set up for testing, and it actually helps to direct therapies. But I would still submit is some of our best therapies for our sickest patients are some of what we would say non-pharmacologic interventions, or some OLIs, learning how to prone, use of steroids. And of course, remdesivir is our antiviral, but as I would say, that's not what I would call a home run treatment yet. And we're still, as you know, without a vaccine, without an effective antiviral, and we're going to be in this pre-protective phase for quite some time to come. And we have pivoted, I think, in terms of pivoting to living with it. I think if you look at our healthcare system and our healthcare workers, we know how to handle COVID. We feel comfortable now in terms of protecting ourselves and protecting our patients. And as you know, we have our other line of business is now getting back almost to pre-COVID levels. And we're doing that very safely, which I think is important for patients and families to know.
Lara, it's interesting. When I think about the work of Cleveland Clinic, at last count, I think we have published 370 scientific research studies on COVID. When you consider the short amount of time that we've been helping to manage this disease, that's an incredible statement about the amazing professionals and the work that's going on here. And I think about the work that you're leading and how it is foundational to much of the research we're doing. Talk a little bit about what you've put together in a very short period of time, which has become was really one of the leading national registries for COVID patients, and helping to understand how we can better manage COVID patients and predict who's going to be positive.
Thank you, Jim. Thank you for the opportunity to participate here and for this question. It's indeed been quite an unforgettable time, if I may use that word, since we started dealing with COVID. As I'm thinking back to what Dr. Wiley was describing as the sequence of events from the first case in Ohio in early March, and then when we started with our research response, we were all working in tandem in order to ensure that the operational capabilities, say, that we are setting to deal with our patients are going in parallel with the research capabilities that we are building to learn about this new disease that was hitting us. And I think Dr. Gordon at some point was sick of me calling him as often as I was in order to coordinate that research effort. On March 15, we decided, just a couple of days before we started the drive-through testing in the clinic, to put together a team that would collect data that could help us in answering the main COVID questions that we were interested in, so that we collect that information in real time as patients were getting tested for the disease and then undergoing care subsequently for it. Initially, the main challenges that we wanted to address related to questions that would help us direct our resources, meaning when you think of a patient with COVID, starting from their diagnosis and ending with their final outcome, the questions that were unclear to us were who is most likely to be positive for COVID. That could help us direct our limited testing resources towards the highest risk people. Going from there, we were suspecting very early on that many patients have COVID, but only a subgroup ends up getting sick enough to require hospitalization. So who is that subgroup, so that we can follow them up more closely? And then after they get hospitalized, who is at most risk of needing ICU admission, needing that precious ventilator that was going to be needed? So when you think about these three nodes, they were targeting the main resources that were suspected to become very limited in our response with COVID: testing, hospital beds, ICU beds, and ventilators. So we wanted to build models, that statistical models that can help us identify in real time these patients as they were going through our system. And we reached out to a team of specialists from across the enterprise, from infectious disease, Dr. Gordon, from the pulmonary specialists, from pediatrics, from the Heart and Vascular Institute. And we worked with them to define the research questions before we built the database. We started with what questions do we want to answer, and then went from there to what data do we need to collect. We worked very closely with our colleagues in information technology to develop methods to abstract that data in an automated way out of our electronic health record, and with a team of dedicated coordinators to collect targeted pieces of information manually about those patients. Within 4 days of the intent of building the registry, we had a registry that included 4,000 patients with more than a couple hundred data elements on each patient. We built our first model, which was designed to predict the likelihood of a positive test in patients presenting with symptoms within 3 weeks of us having the registry. We built a team of 13 leading investigators from across the enterprise within a week of starting with the registry. And we sought research ideas from across the clinic within that first week. We had 225 ideas that were submitted. We worked with our lead investigator teams to pare those down and build teams that can complement each other and coordinate together. We went down from 225 to 143 research projects that are now ongoing using this registry that now has more than 30,000 patients in it, with a much deeper data set on each one of them as the questions have evolved. Many of the questions have already been published in academic journals. as you've mentioned. And many of the outputs from that research have already influenced clinical care or clinical research with clinical trials that are ongoing, or with models that have been implemented in our electronic health record. It's truly been a fascinating journey working with many smart and dedicated people, where we were all working feeling like this is a war. This virus, we have to fight it, we have to conquer it, and we are all working together towards the same goal.
When you think about fighting a war, it's really about team of teams and all the critical elements that need to come together to be successful. And Brian, what I was saying is that, you know, when I think about the foundational building block that laboratory medicine played in this pandemic response, it really has been quite incredible. And when I look back at all of the work and input that you guys have had, can you talk a little bit about the journey that you guys have been on? I mean, starting from, you know, the start of the pandemic when testing was a national crisis and there was no testing, and how, you know, we needed to pivot to so many multiple platforms and respond so quickly. Just an incredible, important piece of all of this.
Yeah, I mean, thanks, Jim. It's been a real journey, as you can imagine. And some of the things that my fellow panelists have talked about really resonate with me. We did feel like we were embarking on a war against this very scary virus. I mean, nobody knew what to expect, but we did sort of start to sort it out. And we thought, okay, we need a really rapid turnaround time. We can't have turnaround times that last days or weeks. So we really focused on getting our testing out in 24 hours. We also knew that we needed a really sensitive and specific test. And so we focused on having tests that were very specific and had high sensitivity. And that meant rolling out our best platforms. And then I would say the third thing that really kind of descended upon us was the need for speed. And I'm talking about launching platforms. And so you took a pretty sleepy group in molecular microbiology who hadn't seen a pandemic before in their careers. That group was really focused on sort of one shift per day, 5 days a week. And, you know, I stormed in there and said, all right, folks, we're open 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Let's get busy. And so we actually brought in people from all over the Institute to help launch COVID testing and really launch this whole department of COVID testing. And so we brought people up from across the Institute. We looked at how we could test, and we worked really hard. Within 10 days, we launched our first test, and we started very humbly. And when Steve says humble, boy, this thing humbled us. So we started with 60 tests per day. And then we ramped up about 600 tests per day at about 2-month intervals over the next 6 months. And so we started on the capacity journey. And so the capacity journey was interesting because after we had our test in, we knew we had great turnaround time, we had very sensitive and specific tests. We had to build capacity because we knew we had a large volume of patients to test, and it could be huge. It ended up being not quite as big as we thought, at least in the initial ways, but we were prepared. And so that meant we had to launch numerous platforms. There was a lot of constraints around reagents and instrumentation because everybody started COVID testing and nobody was ready from a reagent perspective. And so the way that we did that was we launched 6 different platforms, not all at once, but over time. And by having this diversity of platforms, each with their own reagent stream, we've been able to maintain our testing. And we're now up to about 3,000 tests per day. In fact, we just hit 3,000 for the first time yesterday. We've done over 300,000 tests at this point with over 16,000 positives. We've maintained very high quality, high sensitivity, high specificity testing. I mean, there were other aspects of it too. We never thought about the swabbing. Just swabbing this many patients ended up being a journey. We had to hire a bunch of people just to swab and brought people again from across the institute to an institution to swab. There was a big pre-analytics component of transporting swabs all over Cleveland and Northeast Ohio to bring them to main campus for testing. There was the granularity of launching rapid testing. So there are platforms that will perform a test very quickly. We have a very high sensitivity platform that will actually result in about 45 minutes. It's about an hour, hour and a half when you throw in all the pre-analytic component to that. That's all the transportation and logging in and so forth. But we launched that throughout the region so that we would have this rapid form of testing throughout Northeast Ohio, and then bring the rest of it in centrally to do the 24-hour standard turnaround time testing. And I'm, talking about building a team of teams. It's just been an amazing journey. I got to meet people from across the institution that I hadn't spent a lot of time with. I mean, Lara and Steve are two examples of, people that I hadn't really worked with very much, but we got to work together very closely. A lot of what I did with Steve was to prioritize testing. So in the early days, especially when we didn't have as much testing as we do today, we had to prioritize who was going to get the tests. Working with Lara and looking at her registry, that helped a bit to sort of figure it out. But of course, we wanted to provide our tests to the people who needed them most. We wanted to provide rapid testing where it was going to have the most impact. There was a lot of consideration. So I have to say this has been a real journey. We worked with everybody in the clinic. Supply chain was a group that I hadn't worked with very much, but of course, supply chain became very critical for us to supply the reagents, instrumentation that we needed. Even the space planning, we had the space planning guys in to come and knock down walls when we needed them to bring in instruments. And I've never seen those guys move so quickly. I mean, the Cleveland Clinic has moved fast, been very effective. Just a really great team of teams approach to doing this, and proud of my team in testing.
You should be proud of your team. They really responded. Although I'm a little disappointed that they weren't ready for the pandemic, because the rest of us took the classes in how to manage a global pandemic. We were ready. So I don't know what you guys have been doing. No, amazing work. And who, by the way, knew that a testing platform could be as big as a minibus? I think that was the most important finding for me. Bob, you were a little coy, I think, on your description of the work you've done with the state and the region. I mean, I think what people would maybe be surprised at is you've really been helping to lead the state response. And I think the state of Ohio gets a lot of credit for the way they've handled it. Now you're on the forefront of continuing those meetings. I know you have regular meetings with the city, the state, the county, and now you're thinking about the next phase, which is hopefully soon vaccine distribution. How do you see that going, and what are we thinking about relative to getting that out quickly?
Sure. Let me give you a little background. Early on, the governor asked a group of us from Cleveland, Columbus, and Cincinnati to go down and talk to him about COVID and emergency management. And at the time, we had 8 emergency regions, and we suggested that was pretty bulky and a little bit difficult. And we partnered with the National Guard, but we actually proposed a system where we would only have 3 regions or zones. And I got the opportunity to lead Zone 1, which is about 50% of the population of the state. And we took everybody in a congregate facility, all the local health departments, and all the hospital providers, and we linked them in a triad. And so every congregate facility, because we knew from Europe as well as China, that's where these hotspots were going to occur and continue to occur. We knew the elderly were especially vulnerable to the virus and had the high mortality rate. Even now, they only represent about 7% of the cases, elderly over 65, but 40% of the fatalities occur in skilled nursing facilities or assisted living type of facilities. So that became very important. We've driven that rate down in Ohio tremendously by testing the workers in those facilities. Obviously, the residents aren't leaving. It's the workers going in and working in multiple facilities that's really bringing the disease in. We've dropped the positivity rate among the workers to less than the overall positivity rate in the general population. Moving forward, the thing which we're looking at now is vaccines, and Steve knows a lot about vaccines as well, but there are 2 RNA vaccines which are probably at the front of the line and about to come out. They're a little bit challenging because one of them from Pfizer has to be stored at minus 70 degrees centigrade, and the other one from Moderna is minus 20 degrees centigrade, and they have to be given twice. Well, how do you store those vaccines? How do you distribute them? So we're talking to the federal government, including Health and Human Services and Alex Azar, as well as we've created a group within the state of Ohio, and we just had a meeting again today to look at how we're going to distribute these vaccines, and more importantly, who gets the vaccines first. So is it automatically healthcare workers, or is it those people living in congregate facilities? And how much vaccine will be available first? And who is a healthcare worker? And once you define who are essential healthcare workers, what are the other essential workers in the population? And how do you decide what the sequence is going to be with giving those vaccines? So these are things which we're actively engaged in now and actively going through and developing a plan for the governor, which we should have ready by next week.
It's interesting, an amazing level of coordination, and I think we should all be proud of the role that Cleveland Clinic has played in that. Something that's been interesting to me all along during the pandemic is really the way we've levered our worldwide network to really understand the disease. And when you think about our footprint in Northeast Ohio, in Florida, in the Middle East, in London, I think we've really benefited from the information exchange from our leaders across the world as we've kind of watched the pandemic play out, because it's played out differently in different areas, and it's been fascinating. Steve, as you think about the next year, the next 2 years relative to this disease, other diseases like flu, how do you see what's the playbook going to look like? Even if the vaccine is ready and starts to distribute in December, we're not going to be rid of COVID anytime soon. So how do you, from an infectious disease perspective, how do you see us? How should we be thinking about this?
Yeah, another great question. And again, I hesitate to forecast, but I would submit that COVID will probably become another kind of endemic seasonal respiratory illness. And that's going to take a little bit. We are going to be in this, what we'd say, pre-protective phase for a while. As Dr. Wiley mentioned, we anticipate successful vaccines will be delivered. But realistically, I'd be looking to second or third quarter in terms of, you're talking about significant coverage for the homeland. Having said that, Jim, though, I think, there's another issue with vaccine hesitancy even before COVID. And even if we have the vaccines, as you know, even for influenza and things such as HPV and other things, there still were opportunities before. And as an ID person, I'd much rather prevent a disease than treat it. And we all believe that vaccines are probably the highest value in terms of public health, not just for the homeland, but globally. So I think we're going to have to do a better job to the public in terms of selling the value of the vaccines, getting aggressive about what we say vaccine hesitancy. And then your other point about us being a global organization, but I think the lessons here, and again, this is predictable, is that we really do need to care about if there's an outbreak of a respiratory illness or gastroenteritis in Pyongyang or wherever, because we are one global village here. And this won't be the last pandemic, whether it's a respiratory virus or another, what we'd say zoonosis, that is a disease of animals that jumps to man. We know that's going to occur. So the hope here will be that the lessons that we learn will also translate into increased surveillance, data sharing, vaccine capability and production. Some of these platforms, we don't talk about Zika as much anymore, but obviously the Zika vaccine is still in development. And there's other platforms, I think, that we can really make this positive. As we look to the winter, though, you mentioned about other respiratory diseases, and Brian knows this, and Bob, it is now on our platform that if you come with an influenza-like illness, you will be tested. I can't distinguish as a clinician between COVID, say influenza. And so this will become, I think, a part of our platform of testing, not just for this year, but for years to come.
I want to pick up a little bit on the data issue, because I think one of the things it seems to me that's been accelerated as a result of the pandemic is the way we use data and analytics to really drive towards solutions for other things. And Lara, you've talked a little bit about the infrastructure that we've had in place and how we've levered that. Can you speak a little bit more about how we think the future is going to look around artificial intelligence and potentially the way we can use that and our investment in data and analytics to drive better understanding of therapeutics and other things that are going to be important in medicine? And do you think COVID is accelerating that work?
COVID has definitely accelerated that work, Jim. It's just made us realize that we don't always, as physicians and researchers, have the luxury of time to learn about any medical challenge. In the context of a pandemic, like COVID, we needed answers. We needed them now. And we needed answers to so many different questions that were unpredictable beforehand. The traditional tools of data collection and of data analysis are just not designed to be answering questions emergently. So COVID just highlighted to us how critical it is to have infrastructures in place to facilitate massive data abstraction efficiently, and for mapping all of that data into questions and analytic platforms that could be run very quickly. Because the so things like artificial intelligence, for example, would be critical in order to interface with these data platforms that we have in place to look at what could give us our answers. You know, when you're dealing with a completely new question, you don't really know where to look many times. So you need a way to collapse a vast amount of data into an analytic path that will give you an answer. And that is what artificial intelligence facilitates. The other data analytic related issue that COVID highlighted is that we need better ways to integrate our learnings from our data back into our clinical practice. To give you an example, when we developed our models for identifying the patients who are at risk for testing positive, or the patients who have COVID who are at highest risk of progressing to severe illness. That was good, right? But how do we take that from a research answer and put it back into clinical care so that our clinicians can use it? That takes integrating all of those models back into our electronic health record systems, back into our pathways for clinical care. That requires data interfaces and data platforms that didn't necessarily exist very efficiently before COVID. And we had to develop them on the fly so that we can integrate those models in our clinical care so that our highest risk patients were automatically surfaced for our clinicians so they follow them up more closely and give them better care. The other use of artificial intelligence that we had was to identify potentially effective therapeutic drugs. We had a group among our researchers who was using AI to look at FDA-approved drugs that are now on the market, to model them against the virus and see which drugs could be potentially effective. And without AI, we couldn't have done that. We identified 16 of those drugs. We validated that initial finding in the data from the registry to see how many of those drugs were correlated with some better benefits in these cohorts of patients that we were testing. We filtered down from 16 to 4. Now, those 4 drugs are being tested in randomized clinical trials on our patients and across the states. Actually, it's not just clinical trials in Cleveland Clinic, so they really be studied and tested for, for clinical use. So you see how looking at patient data for research is something that through COVID we learned is critical for us to deliver clinical care. When we do research, we're not just doing it because we're curious, we're doing it because we want to help people. And with what we did with the COVID research, we went that full cycle from a curious researcher sitting behind their desk, very similar, I'd say, to the molecular biologist that Brian had to energize to do, to work on the testing. We had to energize these researchers who usually take months and years to develop protocols to do it quickly, and then to move that knowledge down that path from basic science to clinical validation to then randomized clinical trials and effective treatment. That is what we learned from the COVID experience.
Incredible. Brian, so from a lab perspective, I'm going to make an assumption. I don't know the answer, whether it's correct or not, but I have to believe that the pandemic is going to accelerate the investment and innovation for lab and the work that you do. Can you talk a little bit about that? Also, how are we thinking about the next phase of COVID testing? Is it saliva based? Is it blood-borne for antibodies? I mean, where do we see the future, the kind of short-term future around those issues?
Yeah, thanks, Jim. I mean, I was listening to everybody, and Lara's right. I mean, nothing like a pandemic to energize your creative thinking. And listening to Bob, I was struck by how he's already thinking several steps ahead down the road. And I think that, while we might have initially been a little caught unawares with this pandemic, now that we're fully immersed in it, we've been thinking several steps ahead, and that's required a lot of innovative kind of thinking. And so for us in pathology, for instance, we saw down the road that we wouldn't want to test pre-procedure, pre-operative patients in situations where they were exposed to patients who actually had respiratory illnesses. We need to do this kind of testing to keep our hospital open. So we innovated an at-home collect kit so that patients could test themselves outside of the hospital and then deposit those kits in labs or actually in our pharmacies. And so we developed such a kit, we submitted to the FDA for approval, and we're actually currently waiting for FDA approval, but we do expect that it'll be approved. And that's going to be a very innovative thing for us. It'll allow us to test these patients outside the hospital, essentially getting the asymptomatic patients away from the symptomatic patients. Now, in terms of symptomatic patients, what we realized was, boy, we're going to need to test for flu, A and B, respiratory syncytial virus, also known as RSV, and COVID all at the same time, because as great as Steve and his colleagues are, they can't tell the difference clinically between them. So we need to test for all four simultaneously. They're all going to be upon us. And so we developed a so-called quad test. It's a test in, that we can take one swab or we can test for all four pathogens simultaneously. And then even being more creative and more innovative, we have nuances on that where we can test for certain aspects of it very rapidly. So we could eliminate, for instance, RSV in children very quickly using a very rapid RSV-based test. If they're negative, then we reflex to the other tests, flu and COVID, and that might take a little bit more time. But we've had to innovate, think several steps ahead, really get ready instead of reacting, and we're ready. We're ready for flu season. We've got a high capacity, lots of different kinds of testing. We'll be ready for that. Now, in terms of what the next sort of testing look like, people have talked a lot about saliva, and saliva has been and is a very useful specimen. The big problem for us is that we can't currently test for flu and RSV with our saliva specimen. And so we only use saliva in select populations, really, or we will use it in select populations of patients who can't otherwise undergo a nasopharyngeal swab or a nasal swab. But even looking at the NP swab, the nasopharyngeal swab, which is really the gold standard, we've now realized that we can do a nasal swab and that works pretty well. I think there's a lot of innovative thinking around maybe taking different kinds of specimens. For instance, sputum can be very useful in patients who have respiratory symptoms and are far along in their disease to look at the virus. One of the things that we've looked at, as well as others, is actually looking at the amount of virus that patients have. And we do that by measuring something called a CT value, which is basically something that's a PCR-based metric that we look at that tells us how much virus is there. And it turns out, as you might expect, that patients with more virus tend to be sicker. I think that blood-based or antibody-based testing is interesting. The problem with antibody-based testing, since we have antibodies to other coronaviruses, it lacks the specificity that we have with a PCR-based test, which is what we typically use, nucleic acid-based testing, which is highly specific. And so while it might not be as specific, it's not useful for a lot of our settings. However, it might be useful in other settings where you need a very rapid test or you're looking at populations. So we look at antibody testing and sera as being very useful for population-based studies. One of the groups here in our research institute is actually working on a breath-based COVID tests. I don't know if that's going to be, if that'll work out, but of course that would be a really nice test where people could breathe into a tube, for instance, and detect COVID very quickly. And I think there's tons and tons of innovative thinking in the United States. You never know, in the world for that matter, you never know what's coming down the pike. I think people who have different talents will bring different kinds of technologies to bear. And the kind of testing we do today, what will it look like next year? I'm not sure, but we're reading very actively. We certainly try to keep abreast of any developments. We interface with companies quite frequently, and I think that if better testing becomes available, we will be early adopters and bring it on. And it's all about being able to test accurately, quickly, to benefit the patients and caregivers.
Thanks, Brian. I think we're coming up on the hour. I do have one question, and I think that I want to direct to Bob. I think when the history is written in this pandemic, one of the elements of that history is going to be what was likely considered a failure. That might be a strong word, but the failure of public health. How do you think it's going to change? What do you see the future of public health in the United States?
I think public health is going to become a public-private partnership. So when we're talking about supply chain and public health, I think we have to look at the big suppliers, the Amazons and the Walmarts of the world, and other large private companies that can deliver just in time PPE, as well as surgical supplies and other medical supplies. I think we have to keep that in mind, along with the big distributors we have, including AmerisourceBergen and Cardinal and others that we use. I think they're going to be a partnership between large healthcare delivery and local county health departments, because we have all the doctors, we have all the nurses, and we're going to have to help them, and we're going to have to really partner with them if we're going to really have a public health response that's effective and works. And to some extent, we're just developing geospatial analytics, Jim. And that means that now we can track a positive test to a specific address. We can see whether there's 2 positive tests within 100 feet of each other. We can call public health and we can say, hey, you've got a problem in this building on this floor, which you need to address. And if we can do this with COVID, and we're taking this statewide now, just think of where else we could go. We could look for opioids or new opioids on the market, which are causing trouble. We could look at infant mortality. We can look at new diseases outbreak, and we could localize them to specific places where we could really help our public health partners. And I think that's the future and where we're going.
Terrific. Thank you for that. Bob, Steve, Lara, Brian, thank you very much for your time to share the clinic's perspective on how we've managed the pandemic and the ways we're thinking about the future management of the continuing pandemic until we have a cure or vaccine. I think people will benefit from our collective insights, and really appreciate your time today for this panel. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.